When I first played Vampire Survivors, I got the hype. The non-stop power creep, the over-the-top chaos, it felt like an instant classic. But over time, something changed. I found myself drawn to a different game, one that felt snappier, slicker, and ultimately more rewarding. And that game was Brotato. And the more I played, the more I realized it wasn't just different, it was better. But why? For the sake of my own sanity, I needed to figure it out. So I took a closer look behind the facade of both games to understand why, in the end, I keep coming back only to one of them. I'll start with a bit of history and the developers of both games, as I think it has a decent importance in this case. If you want to skip this part and get right to the game analysis, feel free to skip here. For those of you left, I admire your attention span and let's begin. Vampire Survivors was developed by a solo developer from Italy, Luca Galante, also known as Ponko. It first saw daylight as an early access title in late 2021, and by February 2022 it had gained enough traction for Luca to be able to quit his job and fully commit to his game. The main inspiration was from a mobile game for Android released in 2019 called Magic Survival. After the game snowballed, Luca hired his previous colleagues and other freelancers to help weed out some technical challenges. But it was still just a handful of people. While the team focused on technical stuff, Luca continued to develop and update the game, which as of 2025, on rough estimates, has sold over 8 million copies, making Luca one of the most successful indie developers of all time. It's worth noting that before his viral success, Luca started his career in quite a different game industry branch, as he was working in a company which developed gambling games. But we'll get to that later, and now let's quickly glance at the story of Brotato. Brotato also launched as an early access title on Steam. It was first published in September 2022 and saw a full release almost a year later in June 2023. So generally about 1 year after the success story of Vampire Survivors, and most likely also drawing certain inspirations from it. It was developed by a solo developer,
Thomas Gervraud,
better known as Blobfish. After the big success of Brotato, he has kept a pretty low digital presence. I think the best picture of Blobfish as a developer can be painted by looking at his blog, Reddit and YouTube pages. There we can find that he started making games in 2018, and Brotato was by no means his first game. He started with very small scope games like Lost Potato, which is also available on Steam and has a few style elements that are also found in Brotato. Most notably, of course, the ongoing dedication to the potato theme. Blobfish documented his steps and did some incredible introspective analysis, which most likely also allowed him to hit jackpot with Brotato. Last post on his blog is on May 2nd, 2022, where he announces Brotato, his first game using the Godot engine. Now this game has made him a millionaire. And let's find out why I think it's actually better than Vampire Survivors. Whether we want it or not, most players nowadays start by judging a game by its cover, or to be more precise, how it looks at first glance. And well, here we have some substantial differences between the both titles. I must admit that for me, graphics play a pretty secondary role in the actual enjoyment of a game, and some of my most favorite games have very primitive visual presentation, so I'm not going to judge which looks better or worse, but what functional purpose the visuals of these games play and how it ties to the overall experience. Vampire Survivors' general look comes from a simple pixel art asset pack made by Oryx Design Lab. It has some Castlevania-inspired sprites which the developer Luca liked. As he said himself in No Clip documentary, he fell in love with the visuals, the ugly pixels getting scaled the wrong way and modeled up. I believe this decision was quite crucial due to a number of reasons. First of all, when you have limited resources and skill set, making a game look intentionally bad is, in my opinion, better than trying to make it look more polished or spending years making sprites that no one will care about because you've forgotten to develop an actual game loop. Second is that the weird look by itself is a marketing tool. It passes the glance test and makes you at least click on the game page and see why you're being suggested a game with 30-year-old graphics just to find out it was released in 2022 and somehow has overwhelmingly positive reviews. Brotato, in contrast, provides a more clean aesthetic, with clearly defined lines for all the on-screen characters. The assets, although still pretty simple, were made by the developer Blobfish himself. You can see that the design wasn't born overnight. The potato-esque design was already present in the previous games made by Blobfish. The style somewhat reminds me of old-school Cartoon Network characters with the clear black outlines and vibrant colors. From similar-looking games, I could of course mention the Binding of Isaac with less pixelation. The style is pleasing to the eye and definitely takes more effort to pull off, but I would not say that this look has the same "what is this" vibe that Vampire Survivors radiates when you first see it. In both games, as the run develops, the visuals also progress in complexity, and things that are happening on screen at the same time increase exponentially. I must admit that Vampire Survivors reach a higher level of chaos on screen, so that sometimes by the end of a run it's almost impossible to distinguish one game element from another, and I tend to better enjoy the gradual and more controlled visual chaos development of Brotato. Both games have pretty different gameplay world setting. First, you have the map size. The map in Vampire Survivors is enormous compared to Brotato. It takes you a few seconds to go from one end to the other of the crash site arena, while just going from the middle of the map to one of the sides takes, well, forever in Vampire Survivors, as the map is endless with automatically generated layout. I personally find that having this huge map is somewhat useless in Vampire Survivors, as it is just the same few asset patterns pasted over and over to create this vast empty space. I enjoy the tight, more claustrophobic feel of Brotato's arena better than the endless football fields of nothingness in Vampire Survivors. Although one thing where Vampire Survivors does pull ahead is the variety of maps, as the base game features 5 main stages that each have distinct visuals, as well as new mobs appearing in each stage, with the game also having multiple bonus, challenge and secret stages. Some of these stages, as the inlaid library, also mixes up the map style by making it a long stretched corridor. And even though the space feels much tighter, the player still has to cover quite a big distance to find the important game element. Compared to this, Brotato's world design is as primitive as it can be. It's a pretty small scale arena called the crash site, and in the base game this is your only option. And I honestly enjoy it. The game world is not getting in the way of the satisfying loop underneath, and I don't think it would improve my experience if it had different stages and settings, as the simplicity is one of the main forces pulling my preferability scales in the direction of Brotato. As for the actual gameplay, we can start with the similarities shared between the both games. First is that before a play session or a run starts, the player is able to choose from a variety of different characters that each usually can wield up to 6 weapons. Next common thing is that the weapons attack enemies automatically, and the only input the player has is to move the character around. Each play session in both games has a hard time limit, and players have to kill enemies for experience points, which need to be picked up in order to level up, and to be able to defeat the increasingly more difficult mobs. If the core loop is laid out like this, it could seem that this is basically the same game. And although there are certainly many distinct similarities, there are also just as many elements that each game tackles in its own way, and this makes the overall experience quite different for these seemingly similar gameplay loops. A good example of this can be seen by looking over the various characters that each game offers. There are several dozen characters available for the player to choose in each base game. In Vampire Survivors, each character has a different starting weapon or item and slight varieties in passive bonuses and the initial stats. I use the word slight varieties because I would not say that these differences between characters impact my playstyle or experience in any substantial way. I might not have delved deep enough into the min-maxing possibilities that each character offers, but from a casual, occasional player standpoint, it's interesting to unlock new characters and start with different weapons, but as the run progresses, I have a feeling that it becomes less and less important what my starting character was. In Brotato, the characters also have different starting weapon or item, but the differences between initial stats and stat modifiers for each character are greatly different. They push the player in more or less a certain strategy to be used in order to be able to complete a run with each character. Some differences are more broad, like dealing more damage with unarmed weapons, and some can be very specific or restrictive, like being able to equip only one weapon at a time or being able to attack enemies while only standing still. And these vast differences are one of the main drivers for me to return to this game again and again. This keeps each run fairly fresh and motivates the player to push different playstyles to their limits. The next major difference is the way how each game structures a single game session, or what is the progression path of a single run. After choosing a character for the run, in Vampire Survivors the player also needs to choose corresponding stage, modes like Hyper or Endless, and stage modifiers like Arcana or Limit Break. In base game Brotato, you just choose your starting weapon or item and go right to obliterating mobs in the crash site. Play sessions in Vampire Survivors have a hard time limit of 15, 20 or 30 minutes. Each minute a different kind of enemy spawns, so each minute can be considered as a separate wave. A run is considered completed or successful if the stage time limit is reached. After this is completed, the Reaper spawns, which will eventually kill the player. In Brotato, the session is divided up into waves. A standard game is 20 waves long, and the run is considered successful by completing the final wave. The first wave is only 20 seconds long and gets 5 seconds longer each wave until it reaches 60 seconds at wave 9. After that, the waves remain 1 minute long until wave 20, which lasts for 90 seconds. A wave is completed by staying alive until the wave timer ends, or in the last wave, either by surviving until the timer ends, or by killing the final boss enemy. What I like more about the core structure of Brotato's runs is simply that you don't die in the end like in Vampire Survivors. Of course, there's still this satisfaction of getting to the end of a stage, but the final moments of each run still, most of the time, will be demise of the player character. It's also not like this formula is intrinsically bad. For example, in Hades, this loop kept me hooked for hours on end, but at least in Hades, the driver to continue was to keep inching forward and getting out of the underworld. And while in Vampire Survivors, you also unlock more stages and new characters, the mostly inevitable doom just feels worse than conquering the final wave of Brotato, where if you win, you leave as a champion rather than getting rewarded by the sweet embrace of death. To get to the end of a run, in both games the players will need to choose between a variety of weapons, items and upgrades, and there are substantial differences in how this upgrade system is structured. In Brotato, when the player kills enemies, they drop materials. They are used both as experience points for leveling up and also as currency to be spent in the shop. You spend the wave trying to collect as many materials as possible. At the end of each wave, if you have collected enough materials, you'll be presented with the level up screen, where you have to choose different tier stat upgrade. After that comes the shop, where by spending the collected materials, the player can purchase different weapons and items. Usually, a character is able to wield up to 6 weapons at a time and unlimited amounts of items. The shop always offers 4 items, which can be rerolled also using materials. Each item has a clear description on how it impacts the player's stats or abilities, while the stats are presented on the side. Very often, the items have dual effects. where they increase one stat while decreasing another. When choosing the items, you have to plan ahead, keep a balance between offensive and defensive stats that play to your character's unique gimmicks. It's a surprisingly strategic process, and the toughest hurdle to overcome in each run is to choose the right amount of stats to lean into by choosing the right items after each wave. As the materials function as currency, there is also the economic factor at play. Which items can you justify buying this round? Is it better to reroll in the hope for better items or not to spend any at all? Vampire Survivors handle this process in quite a different way. While the killed mobs also drop experience gems, the player can obtain new weapons and items only when leveling up or by finding chests that are dropped by tougher enemies. When leveling up, the player is presented by 3 to 4 weapons or items. There is limited interactivity. You can choose only one of the options, and if you're purchased the corresponding power-ups, you can also skip or banish up to 10 times. The other way to get upgrades are the chests that drop a predetermined amount of 1 to 5 item upgrades. There are certain aspects of this system which I find inferior to Brotato. One of the main mechanics unique to Vampire Survivors regarding upgrades within a run are the evolutions, whereby combining certain weapons and passive items, the weapons evolve into superior, stronger forms. Only by doing this, the player will be able to beat the harder stages. But the combinations to unlock these evolutions are at first hidden and have to be found by trial and error or by having the wiki open. So the hardest struggle to overcome is not to strategically choose the right items, but to get lucky with a combination or finding the right answer online. Even more, after you find the combinations, they can be accessed via the grimoire. So when you're at the power-up screen, it would be really handy to have a look at the grimoire to check these combinations, right? Right? Well, wrong. Real gamers either know all this by heart or have 2 monitors to keep the wiki open on the second screen. At first, I could not get my head around why this would be a conscious game design decision, because it clearly is one. But taking a step back and looking at the game in a broader way, I might have a theory, and the main component of this theory is luck, and the feeling of getting lucky. One part that I intentionally skipped while overviewing the visual presentation of Vampire Survivors is how certain game elements have uncanny similarity to gambling games. From the bright visuals and sounds to literally opening crates with spinning items and coins shooting out of it. It's no secret that the developer Luca had previous experience in companies that develop these kinds of games, and while there are other factors why people get addicted to them, undoubtedly one of these factors is feeling of getting lucky. Adam Millard, the architect of games, has a brilliant video expanding on this idea, which I've linked below, so I won't go into too much detail on how or why this works, but within the scope of the comparison with Brotato, it explains why certain elements, like the grimoire, isn't clearly presented to the player, by keeping it away from the direct center of attention, like the stat screen in Brotato. When the player initially stumbles upon these evolutions, they are exciting and full of mystery. But as I progressed and spent more hours with the game, the novelty rubbed off, and now I'm left with only the choice of waiting to get lucky again or opening the wiki. It's less about making the right strategic decisions each time, but more about accidentally making a right decision one time and afterwards just replicating it with different characters. Of course, it's nothing intrinsically bad with playing a game with wiki open. Genbear has quite a popular video on this topic, which I've also linked below, and it's a whole world by itself, but to keep it short, I've come to terms with myself that it's not something that I personally enjoy doing very much, and this naturally also translates to my overall experience of Vampire Survivors. Last part I would like to highlight is how both games handle the meta progression cycle. In Vampire Survivors, during each run, the player also earns gold, which is used in the power-up store between runs. Upgrades purchased here are permanent and applied to all characters. By doing this, the player gets the feeling of getting progressively stronger, and also there are no wasted runs, because each time you earn at least some gold, using which you can purchase an upgrade or a new character. And although this provides a sense of constant growth, and players in general like to see a number go up, I can't say I enjoy this grind-based loop better than Brotato's way of handling this. Brotato takes a more skill-driven approach to its progression. By completing runs, you unlock new characters and new danger levels that make the game harder, not easier. Only element that makes the next subsequent runs easier are the unique items that are unlocked after completing a run with a character for the first time. Usually these items play into the specific character's strengths, so it would be easier to complete a run with the same character in higher danger levels, which bring new and stronger enemies to the player to fight. Vampire Survivors systems rewards persistence over everything else. If you play for long enough, eventually you'll be able to purchase all the upgrades, unlock all the characters, and continue to complete your collection. And it's not a bad system, but the more skill-based, minimalistic meta progression of Brotato keeps me wanting to go back again and again. Trying out different builds and wacky strategies keeps me going forward and pushing towards completing the game 100% in a fun, grind-free mindset while keeping each run somewhat fresh. And so, after looking at all these similarities and differences, what's my main takeaway from all this? It's clear that Vampire Survivors and Brotato share the same core formula: automatic combat, character variety, and a satisfying power curve, but the execution leads to a very different experiences. Vampire Survivors thrives on sheer chaos, with an ever-expanding arsenal of weapons and dopamine-fueled power fantasy. It's a game that embraces flooding the screen with enemies and projectiles until it feels like you're barely in control, but in the most exhilarating way possible. But for me, Brotato refines this formula into something more engaging in the long run. The tighter arenas, shorter runs, and clearer character distinctions make every decision feel more meaningful. Instead of overwhelming spectacle, it offers a more controlled challenge that keeps me wanting to come back. The focused design, combined with the deeper item interactions and strategic depth, makes it a better game for me. If you love the spectacle and pure madness of Vampire Survivors, I completely get it. It's an experience like no other. But if you're looking for something that feels more structured, more replayable, and just a bit more skill-based, Brotato is the stronger choice. In the end, I really hope that this video motivates at least one person to try out either of these games and experience the thrill for themselves. And if you made it this far in the video, I truly thank you for your time. If you enjoyed the video, I would greatly appreciate it if you left a like or a dislike if you didn't enjoy it. And leave a comment if there are other things you like or dislike about any of these games, or if you would like to see more content in similar fashion. Stay safe, and bye for now.